But look, let's revert to one of the most basic principles of debating, establishing definitions. Now, we hear a lot of discussion about what left is and what right actually means. And the first thing most people will notice is that it changes from country to country and from year to year. Now, there are some hilarious jokes running around online where old lefties are being labelled far right because they say gender is binary. That's now a far right topic. Now, personally, I like to strip it back to the basics. There's a political line. And on the furthest left edge, you have absolute government. And on the furthest right, you have anarchy. Now, political parties then scatter themselves along this with collectivist regimes being mainly on the left and the liberal democracies being toward the right. Now, for me, I don't include anything else in the definition for a primary purpose. Sometimes people like to say nationalism says if you're right wing, but there are plenty of leftist nationalistic regimes that were very totalitarian, let's say that. Is this a pretty fair base to start a political discussion from, or do you disagree with me?
I don't disagree, but I think in terms of understanding it in a political science way, when we go extreme left and extreme right, they don't go off in a straight line into infinity. They tend to curve around and almost meet each other. And I think that's the problem where you start seeing extreme left, extreme right almost replicating each other, but with different original bases. And one way to think of this, there's an old sort of Soviet joke, and Comrade 1 says to Comrade 2, what's the difference between communism and capitalism? And Comrade 2 says, well, in communism, man oppresses man. In capitalism, it's the other way around. And it kind of makes sense of that whole circular argument that we get into when we start looking at the extremes of ideologies. But we begin by looking left being about the group and society being more important, whereas for the right, we look at the individual as being more important. Now, of course, as we get into the extremes of the Nazi regime, it was all about the nation state, which is like extreme conservatism as opposed to individualism. And in the left, when we get to the extreme, is actually more anarchist in that we're trying to overthrow the state. But we really need to look at, if you wanted to understand this in a sort of logical way, we would need to look at ideologies as being systems of beliefs that are represented systematically. And the way that we would start is probably historically, and we'd have to look at the origins of conservatism, then through liberalism, then socialism, and then communism. And when we do that, if we get to the current era, it's less about ideologies used to be a program that followers could relate to and that they could live out in their lives and their principles. Whereas today, it's much more about identity politics. It's not about following a program, but it's about creating a program that makes you feel good. And so it's a very sort of strange time that we live in.
You see, it's interesting. I don't actually include conservatism as an indication of left or right because, like capitalism, it can exist in a totalitarian system or in an anarchical system. So I know there are plenty of conservative religious systems like Islamic systems, but you wouldn't call them right-wing. Most of them are hardcore socialists. So when I see like the Nazi regime you mentioned, well, that's a totalitarian system, so I put that on the left. And you can have free market, low government parties like the Liberal Party used to be in Australia, and they're on the right. But I don't put them on the right because of conservatism. I put the right because they believe in small government. But that's just where I'm coming from in my argument. But most people understand that pure totalitarianism is bad. But there are still plenty of utopians who view that anarchy might be fun because they like to go walking in nature with a stick. Mind you, they still come home and want medical care and a good meal every now and then. But Michael, is pure anarchy in its proper form, not in its socialist form, but its true anarchy, is that just as bad and unworkable for civilization as, say, a communist system?
It's interesting because the political ideologies historically begin and end with anarchy. And anarchy in this definition, and this is the trouble too, when we talk about communism with a big C, it's very different than communism with a small c, like liberalism, you know. So there's ideological versus the actual political systems, which they're influenced one by the other, but they're very different in terms of how we classify them. So if we begin with anarchy, which is like a sort of dog-eat-dog world, an animal world, then we have Hobbes coming in and Leviathan saying that we need a strong state, because if we don't have a strong state, we will hurt each other and we will live like animals, and it's a life that's hardly worth living when we have an alternative. So Hobbes sort of introduces the original conservative idea of a strong government that protects us from each other and from ourselves. Now, the trouble with that, of course, is that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, if we have a government that can do whatever it wants, we have a totalitarian government. And so the next sort of step, which starts to move toward liberalism and the separation of powers, comes from Locke. And he opposed monism and the ultimate power of the state. He believed that there was a social contract, and that if a government overstepped the mark, then people could actually revolt against that government. Now, in modern times, we have democracies and we have regular voting, at least in liberal democracies, that are, real votes, as opposed to the recent one we saw in Russia, for example. But the main difference, I suppose, is that we start to move away from the idea of government, and then we start to move into John Stuart Mill and the idea of the individual. And so this sort of shifts away from, so basically we accept that we need a strong government, but then we need rights to protect us from that government. The next step is the responsibilities and the individual. And this is where we start seeing liberalism with a small L on the right side of politics, where the individual is regarded as the most important actor in society, and they are responsible for looking after their own happiness within the bounds of the law.
Well, you also can't have 9 billion people walking around aimlessly with sticks, hoping that it's all just going to work out fine, because we know that having no government at all doesn't work either. You end up in a dictatorship of the individual, where people start preying on each other. So there does have to be some middle ground. And the reason that we're having this discussion at all is because right now our culture and the West in general is going through this period of time where it needs to work out what it expects from government, what it believes government to be, what sort of society it wants to be. And part of that is because it is importing a lot of people from a lot of different types of societies. And we're now saying, well, okay, what sort of thing do we actually want to live in? And I think that confusion has left a lot of particularly young people unsure what a functioning society looks like, because they've never been told anything other than communism is great by their lecturers.